Welcome everyone who's joining us from around the world. We're just waiting a few minutes before we begin our discussion with Dr. Azim Ibrahim on what next for Myanmar's Rohingya after the coup. So we're just waiting for a few members to join before kicking off this conversation. All right, I guess we'll begin our webinar today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining us from around the world today. Welcome to the Arab News Research and Studies Briefing Room webinar titled, What Next for Myanmar's Rohingya After the Coup? Now, today's conversation is with Dr. Azim Ibrahim, a director at the Center for Global Policy and author of the book, The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Genocide, and a previous panelist on the briefing room not long ago and regarding a very similar topic, with this sort of acting as a follow-up given the recent events that have unfolded in Myanmar. Now, on January 3rd, Myanmar's military launched a coup and detained the country's civilian leader, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, as the international community braces the test of having to decide how to approach the country that has been slowly transitioning into a democracy following decades of military junta rule, some 600,000 Rohingya remain in the Rakhine state, including 120,000 who have been confined to camps. This is notwithstanding the some 700,000 that have already fled to neighboring Bangladesh and are stranded between Cox's Bazar and Bhasan Char. Now, we're aiming to have a 20-minute conversation with Dr. Azim, and we'll allocate a further 10 minutes afterwards for questions from the audience. Now, please use the Q&A function found on your screens below to submit your questions. And we hope to be able to answer all the questions, but given the time constraints, we can't guarantee that all of them would be able to go through. And now, without further ado, Dr. Azim, with everything going on and all eyes on Myanmar, how will this coup really affect the Rohingya?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Tariq. Absolutely wonderful to be back with the briefing room. So in terms of your question, I think it's very important to try to understand, what exactly has happened here, what actually has changed. And I think one could make the argument that not really much has changed, despite the fact that there was a coup and the civilian government has now been detained and overthrown, essentially, with the leaders, Aung San Suu Kyi, the president, and the senior party leadership have all been detained. The reality is that not much has actually changed. Despite the fact that we did have elections in Myanmar on 2 occasions, many would argue that it wasn't actually a real democracy by any stretch of the imagination. You cannot have a democracy in which 25% of the seats are automatically allocated to the military. The military still retains control of the 4 major ministries in the country: foreign affairs, defence, internal and border. And you can't have a situation in which a democracy gets engaged in genocidal activity and entire swaths of the population, millions of people, are not permitted to vote. So one could argue that the military was always in power in Myanmar. They was always in full control, but they had a veneer of democracy to try to insulate them against outside parties and outside criticism. And now the military has simply removed that veneer and taken direct control once again. So one could argue that not much has actually changed. The military was in power before, and the military is in power now. Now, what do we say in terms of how this will actually affect the Rohingya? Now, I think this could be interpreted in a number of ways. First of all, there is obviously a case in the ICJ against Myanmar that's pending at the moment, a case that was brought by the Gambia, a case of genocide. Now, will this case be affected in any shape or form? I think this is highly unlikely, because the case was not against a civilian government or against the military. The case is actually against the state of Myanmar, and the state still remains completely intact. And in fact, I think that the case may actually have been strengthened, because if you remember, one of the arguments that Aung San Suu Kyi used when she went to the ICJ to defend the military, incidentally, was that there are sufficient internal mechanisms within Myanmar, within the democratic process, to hold those responsible for any of these crimes, to hold them accountable. Now, she did not. Her strategy was essentially two-pronged. First of all, to deny that there's a genocide going on, and they accepted that they may have been crimes, committed by individual soldiers, individual commanders, but this was not an intentional mechanism. This was not an intentional purpose of the military. And secondly, to argue that there is sufficient internal mechanisms in place to hold those responsible, to bring them to account. Now, the ICJ only looks at these kinds of cases when there is insufficient internal ability to do that. But now that the military has overthrown even the veneer of democracy, all the democratic institutions have now been diluted. So the case in the ICJ, I suspect, has actually been strengthened by this action by the military. Now, does the military care? That is the next question. I don't think that they probably care much in terms of what's actually happened. I think the military has probably made a calculation that this is actually in their benefit over the long term. We have to think back and remember that one of the reasons why they had elections in the first place is because the military was very unpopular in Myanmar, and the sanctions, international sanctions, were hurting them quite badly. So the military was forced to have these elections. They set up this political process. This entire political system was set up by them. They are the key architects behind it, in which Aung San Suu Kyi could not even become the president. This was a clause that was designed specifically to keep her out of the presidency. So she had this title of state councillor, even though she was the de facto civilian leader. But the military, in reality, always ran the show. And now we have a situation in which, China is now playing a much bigger role in Myanmar. They're the biggest investors in infrastructure and development and financing in Myanmar. And so the military has probably calculated that they can probably absorb a lot of the sanctions and weather a lot of the sanctions that may be forthcoming from the United States and elsewhere because of this coup. And at the same time, the military also learned that despite the fact that they were engaged in full-scale genocide against the Rohingya minority, China used its veto power at the Security Council to protect it, and that protection will still continue. So we have obviously a hearing in the Security Council today, and we expect China to use its veto to protect Myanmar from any sanction whatsoever. And I think the third aspect that they probably realise is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the military was very unpopular, which is what forced them to have elections in the first place. But now we have a situation in which the military is not as unpopular as it was before. Now we have to cast our mind back to 1988 during the Saffron Revolution, when there was an uprising by the Buddhist monks in Myanmar. And this uprising essentially forced the military on the back foot, and they have learned the lesson from that. So now they have, within every military unit, they have Buddhist clergy. Buddhist clerics are completely integrated, almost like spiritual advisors. And so they have the extreme Buddhist clergy on side. And since the operation against the Rohingya, which was essentially justified by the extreme Buddhist clergy, the military has actually become relatively quite popular. So, the military has obviously made a calculation that, look, they may not be as unpopular as they were before, so they could take the people with them in terms of this coup. So I think for the Rohingya in particular, this could spell an immediate backlash, because one of the things I recommended in the recent pieces that I put together is that one thing that the West must do is to try to ensure that there are red lines drawn against the persecution of minorities by the military, particularly if things start going wrong. The scapegoat, there's plenty of minorities that are scapegoats within the country, not just the Rohingya, but other minority groups, the Karen, the Kashen, the Shan, etc. And the West must draw some red lines that they will not tolerate any sort of persecution, increased persecution of these minorities. Remember, these are some of the longest running civil wars in the world against these minorities. So, and it's always been a case that when the military's popularity declines, they increase these kind of campaigns against these minority groups. So the immediate term for the Rohingya doesn't certainly look good. I think the probability of the repatriation of the Rohingya it was already almost next to zero, but it's diminished significantly further. So this is a real challenge now for countries like Bangladesh, who are hosting so many Rohingya minority, that the ability to repatriate them has now diminished even further.
Thank you, Dr. Azim. It's quite insightful commentary. I wanted to ask you, something that caught my eye was the fact that you stated how China is the biggest investor, and indeed, President Joe Biden, U.S. President Joe Biden, just came in and condemned the act as an act against democracy. Now, I wanted to ask you, given can we see any sort of military escalation from these Western actors if, in fact, the military does increase its persecution of these ethnic minorities? And where do these Rohingya stand in between all of this, and where else would they go, given all the things that are going on right now?
Well, the probability, Tariq, of any sort of military intervention from the West is, probably next to zero. The chances of that happening are very, very slim. This is President Biden's first foreign policy test, and I think he's very highly unlikely to get involved in some sort of quagmire. And the reality is that there is no actual scope of intervening militarily against the Myanmar military. I think what the US will focus on, the US and the West in particular, is focus on is trying to ensure that ensure that Aung San Suu Kyi is released, and some sort of veneer of democracy can be restored. I think beyond that, we're not going to see much kind of action. I think President Biden will be very cautious in terms of how he's going to proceed from here, particularly as Myanmar is actually getting much closer to China. Now, we have to understand also that one of the reasons why during the last administration, when President Biden was in office as vice president, during the Obama administration, President Obama visited Myanmar on 2 occasions. And for any country, Tariq, to get a visit from the President of the United States is always a very big deal for that country. Now, why would Obama visit on 2 occasions? President Obama visited because Myanmar was one of the most closed and suspicious countries in the world, always very suspicious and skeptical of outsiders, almost like North Korea is today. And the US was concerned that as Myanmar opens up, it will fall under the sphere of influence of China. And as we know, China is now, expanding throughout the region. They have an insatiable demand for resources, and they're the biggest investors in Southeast Asia. The whole architecture of Southeast Asia is now being reconfigured to meet China's demand for these resources. China is the biggest investor in Myanmar, and access to Myanmar gives access to China through the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, and thus they can surround India. So China has ambitions to be a global superpower, but before it can become a global superpower, it must become a regional power. And that means keeping its regional nuclear rival India in check. Access to Myanmar gives it access to the Bay of Bengal and to the Indian Ocean, and they can avoid the Straits of Malacca. And along with the ports in Gwadar and Singapore, they can completely surround India. So you have these very large geopolitical machinations going on between superpowers, nuclear powers. Minority groups like the Rohingya simply do not fit into that equation. So I don't anticipate you'll see much in terms of action from the United States, any sort of physical action, military action, any sort of kinetic action. I think they'll be resorting to trying to put pressure on them, trying to put sanctions on them, Magnitsky sanctions, which are targeted to individuals, which will not be as effective simply because the military chief was already under sanctions, General Min Aung Hlaing. He was already under sanctions, and these sanctions were really not as effective simply because all it does is stop them visiting the West. And they didn't have much desire to visit the West. Most of their financial kind of holdings that they have from corruption and elsewhere are actually held in Singapore and Macau in China, so they're kind of immunized from that as well. So they've clearly made a calculation that the West has options are extremely limited.
Thank you, Dr. Azim. Now, in the previous panel discussion, we spoke about how the Rohingya's diaspora community is not as strong as other ethnic minorities. That way, they don't have that much of a bigger voice or a bigger rallying with them in order to ensure their rights, etc. Does this coup, for example, put any highlights on the Rohingya crisis and gives an opportunity for civil society groups and NGOs across the world to actually try to aid this community more?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges that the Rohingya have continuously faced, is that they really don't have very effective oppositional voices, and this is by design. This is not something that simply happened because the Rohingya are incapable of doing it. The Rohingya have been marginalized by Myanmar for the last half century. They have been denied access to education, access to healthcare, access to any sort of facilities. The majority of the Rohingya in Myanmar were, laborers, fishermen, farmers, rickshaw pullers. So it's very difficult for them to actually mobilize and lobby for themselves in Myanmar or even outside Myanmar. So they haven't been as effective as other marginalized groups in terms of organizing and getting their voice heard. They really are, amongst the most disenfranchised community. So I think that the onus thus falls on other civil society groups to step up and try to bring awareness to this situation and try to bring more analysis in terms of what is actually happening and more awareness in terms of what's happening to the Rohingya, and give them some sort of ability and platforms to actually speak for themselves, because that's very important, is that to allow them to actually speak about how they feel about this situation in terms of what's happening. But they're in a very precarious situation, simply because that they don't have the abilities and the infrastructure to actually support their campaign. So it does fall upon others to actually speak on their behalf.
And finally, given that I'm noticing the time is about coming up at an end, finally, I just want to ask you, is in reality, are the Rohingya able to return to their country at some point in time?
I think, Tariq, the probability of them returning, in all honesty, is very, very low. I think the chances of it happening are extremely, extremely low. As I mentioned, the Myanmar military has spent over half a century trying to get rid of them. They finally did so in 2017. And it's very interesting to know one of the reasons why the military undertook this campaign in 2017 and not before is because they realized that Aung San Suu Kyi defends them in the public domain. So the civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi, the most famous citizen in Myanmar, a global icon, defended the military in public. And as I mentioned before in our previous session, it's very common for organizers and perpetrators of genocide to undertake a dry run, to undertake a test run to see if they can get away with a full-scale genocide. The Myanmar military did this in 2016, in October 2016, and when they invaded a number of villages, burnt them to the ground, and expelled 40,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. And the important lesson that they learned from that is that Aung San Suu Kyi defends the military in public. And so, when the BBC's Fergal Keane, for example, said to her that ethnic cleansing is going on in your country, she said ethnic cleansing is far too strong a term to use for what is happening. Both sides are equally to blame. So she drew a moral comparison between the aggressor and the victim. And she also, when the United Nations produced a report in March 2017 saying that 52% of Rohingya females had been raped, the ones that made it to Bangladesh, she said on her Facebook page that this is fake rape. So this is an important lesson that the Myanmar military learned, is that Aung San Suu Kyi defends the military in the public domain, and she became a shield for all criticism against the military. And so now that, this is precisely why they actually undertook the full genocide in 2017. And so the probability of the military backtracking on any of this is very, very slim. There's absolutely no interest for them whatsoever to try to reverse the situation. And look, the reality is, Tariq, is that the Rohingya have actually got nowhere to return back to. When they were driven over the border into Bangladesh, the Myanmar military very swiftly mined the border to make sure that none of them can come back. They also burnt down their villages, bulldozed them, bulldozed the land, and the land has already been redistributed to local Rakhine Buddhists. So the facts on the ground have changed. The Rohingya have actually got nowhere to go back to. All the land is gone, has already been redistributed. And this is a tactic that is used very effectively by governments that engage in this kind of genocidal activities, to change the facts on the ground as quickly as possible. So any sort of peace deal, any sort of agreement, any sort of pressure can then be resisted to say, well, look, the reality is this is just not practical anymore. The whole situation on the ground has actually changed.
Thank you, Dr. Azim. I noticed that there are a few questions that we have. The first is from Daniel. He says, you mentioned in your last webinar that more Western pressure was needed on the government of Myanmar to help the country. And you mentioned the red lines today. Do you think that all of the international community's focus will actually shift towards pressuring the military to restore democracy, thus not focusing on the Rohingya and not taking their plight seriously enough all over again?
I think that's a very good question, Daniel, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think this is essentially what's going to happen now, is that we will now see a full concerted effort by the international community to try to restore, the apparatus of democracy, irrespective of how imperfect that democratic structure actually was, and much less emphasis on human rights and minority groups. And so we will possibly see restrictions on international media entering into Myanmar. There were already internet blackouts and information restrictions. But now I suspect that the entirety of the emphasis will be on restoring Aung San Suu Kyi, restoring some sort of vestiges of the democracy, democratic structure, and much less on human rights and trying to protect these minority groups. And there'll be simply less emphasis and attention on what the military actually gets up to internally against these minority groups.
Thank you, Dr. Azim. Another one from Sanjay. How do you feel about the stand? How do you feel about the stand of a democratic country like India takes on the question of the Rohingya? Should countries like India be more vocal on the Rohingya issue?
Yeah, and that's a very good question as well. The reality is that, as I indicated, the question of Myanmar's democracy was always very suspect. And unfortunately, I think we see a similar thing in India as well. I think India has kind of used, and this is most unfortunate because it's probably it's the largest democracy in the world and one of the most important democracies, particularly when it comes to trying to be a buffer against Chinese influence in the region. And India has not treated its Rohingya minority very well. They are in the process, Prime Minister Modi is in the process of trying to remove some of the Rohingya from their countries, trying to repatriate them. This is going to be a real challenge because he's got nowhere to repatriate them to. And I think over the long term, some of the actions that have been taken by the government of India against its own minority groups straight out of the Aung San Suu Kyi Myanmar playbook. And this is most unfortunate because India is such an important country, particularly when it comes to President Biden's new vision of trying to create an alliance of democracies against the increasing influence of China around the globe. India is one of the most pivotal players in that equation, and its own dilution of the democratic structures simply does not help that process. So I think India can play a much bigger role, and its relationship with Myanmar should also be called into question, particularly as Myanmar is becoming such an important player to China for its geopolitical domination of the region. And we are all fully aware of the relationship that India has with China, the difficult relationship which we've seen transpire in the Himalayas most recently, with the Gulwan attack and so on. So India has to tread this ground very carefully and trying to support the Myanmar military, with the relationship and the kind of trade and the defence cooperation is something that really has to be looked into a lot more thoroughly.
Thank you, Dr. Azim. We have time for one more question from Noor Arlene. How do you foresee the state of the ASEAN? The Southeast Asian nations' reactions on Myanmar's coup have been mixed, and some countries, such as Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, are saddled by the Rohingya crisis.
Now, another great question from Noor. The reality is that ASEAN have a very strict policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of member countries. And they do this simply because most of the member countries are involved and engaged in, in processes and discrimination against minority groups. So they simply cannot call out one country because they'll all be guilty of very similar kinds of crimes. So I don't expect much from the ASEAN. The ASEAN have turned a blind eye in the past against discrimination against minority groups, whether it's the Rohingya or others. So I don't anticipate there's going to be much action from ASEAN at all. I don't think it was even on their agenda. I think the only time it appeared on their agenda is when it started affecting some of the ASEAN countries, when boatloads of Rohingya started ending up in countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, etc. And those countries are simply unable to absorb such large numbers. This is when they actually brought the issue up of the Rohingya. So the concern was that there's too many Rohingya arriving in our countries rather than actually what's happening to the Rohingya within Myanmar.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Azim, for today. And that concludes our talk. And thank you, everyone who has joined for this very insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me again, Tariq.